Everyone. Good morning, good afternoon. I'm Derek Chollet of the German Marshall Fund, and I'd like to welcome you to this week's update on the coronavirus crisis from Europe. And I'm very pleased to be joined today by three terrific colleagues, starting with Kristine Berzina in Brussels, who's a senior fellow with GMF's Alliance for Securing Democracy. And Kristine will focus on the situation as seen from Brussels, but also, given her expertise in the Baltics, also touch on how this crisis is playing out in the Baltics. Next, we'll turn to my dear friend and old colleague, Ivan Vejvoda, a longtime GMFer, served in many important roles at GMF over the years, and for the last several years has been in Vienna, although he'll be joining us today from Belgrade. But Ivan is now the director of the Future of the Europe project, and is a senior or a permanent fellow at the Institute for Human Sciences in Vienna. And lastly, another longtime friend and GMF colleague, Pavol Demeš, who will be joining us from Bratislava. And Pavol is currently a non-resident senior fellow of the GMF, but has been a longtime senior figure in GMF and has been a key part of many GMF's efforts, particularly in Central Europe. So he'll be touching on the situation in Slovakia, but also more broadly in the Central European region. So what I've asked each of our speakers to do is spend about 5 minutes up front each to just give a quick situational report of the crisis as it's playing out and the current efforts at reopening from each of the places where they're sitting. But also to touch on some of the larger policy questions that are playing out, whether it's the domestic debate in the countries where they are, or also the broader questions being raised about the European project or the transatlantic relationship. And what we'll do for the Q&A, which we'll leave hopefully about a half an hour for at the end, we're going to try something different this time. We're going to actually be able to hear everyone's voices. And so if you do have a question, use the hand raise feature in the Zoom system, and it should be a little hand emoji at the bottom of your screen. I'll be able to see when you've raised your hand, and I'll be able to call on you, and we'll be able to unmute you. You can ask your brief question, and then we'll turn to our speakers for an answer. So without further ado, I'd like to turn it over to Kristine to start things off. Over to you, Kristine from Brussels.
Thanks so much, Derek. So good morning to everyone in the US, and good afternoon for those of you who are also here in Europe. I've come to you from Brussels this morning, where I work in the GMF office. And Brussels is and Belgium is in the middle of the deconfinement and opening up process. So Belgium has been very hard hit by coronavirus. Up until now, there have been over 56,000 cases confirmed, and testing has been very limited until very recently. So there are many more cases than that. The death toll is about 9,186 today, and day on day, right now this week, there are more than 30 additional deaths. So for a small country, this is really a significant toll. The country went into lockdown in March, and starting May 4th, there have been successive waves of reopening. Public transportation and construction stores first, followed by all stores opening May 11th, and then a broader also social opening this week. Certain classes of schools have also reopened this week. The last years of the primary school, last years of secondary school have returned. But in general, people still are mostly staying home. When you look at the numbers about what is happening on the street right now, on Saturday, the busiest shopping day, now that all stores have been open and people haven't been even able to get into most stores, the volumes were at 60% of normal in terms of people coming in and out. During the week, it's about 30 to 40%. So even when you take away the lockdown officially, people are still largely staying at home in Belgium. When you look out onto the street, it doesn't really, there are a lot of people out and about. Masks are recommended, but you do not see them a lot. And where they are being worn, the way they are being worn doesn't look to be terribly effective. So there is a very mixed policy on that. If you're taking public transportation, you have to have a mask. Hairdressers are open this week, and if you want to go get your haircut, you have to wear a mask. But if you're under the age of 12, or if you're out and about, there's no requirement for it. And this leads to a very confused situation. The government here has been really responsive, trying to get people to be able to see small groups gradually. And it's been complicated to try to keep track of what is and is not permitted, because there are all sorts of exceptions that are being carved out. For example, in advance of Mother's Day, or other situations where the assumption is that people will probably break isolation and break quarantine to see each other. And adjustments are being made for that. So since May 10th, people are allowed to see 4 other people and to create small bubbles with each other, but you're supposed to try to keep those only to those 4 people. When you put together all these carved out exceptions, it gets really messy. And so I think there's a wait and see approach to see what happens next, because with all these exceptions, people are circulating a lot more freely. And if a few days ago we had 50 additional hospitalizations, today there are 70. Day to day, these things change. Sometimes right after the weekend, numbers are lower. This is perfect in terms of understanding it, but there's a sense that numbers could rise again now that things are being relaxed. And that's something that people are keeping an eye on. What happens next? And the summer is really something worrying. So starting yesterday, for the first time, people with second homes in Belgium have been able to go to those. Otherwise, Belgium has really densely populated cities, and lots of people do have second homes, which are in more sparsely populated areas. They have not been allowed to go to those until yesterday. That has now been lifted, so people will move around more. It seems that in the summer, crowded beaches will have reservation processes online. You'll have to buy a ticket to be able to go to a beach with a time slot. Small beaches, not big beaches like Ostend, yes. So things are going to be different, but enforcement is a different question too. So we'll see, and I'm a little bit concerned also about watching the numbers go up and the very piecemeal approach to masks and other protections and what that might mean here. But there is a sense that things are picking up in various ways. The other place that I do keep an eye on is Latvia. So I cover a lot of questions about Central and Eastern Europe professionally, but I am Latvian. And so this is also personally very important for me. And so when you look at the Baltic States, this is an example where the numbers are dramatically low. So the Baltic States, and Latvia in particular, has done a wonderful job of keeping numbers low. Some of this is luck and some of this is really good policy. So the Baltic States collectively have had fewer than 150 deaths. Latvia has had 22, Estonia and Lithuania have had a little over 60. The total case counts in Latvia are a little over 1,000. In Estonia, Lithuania, a bit under, in Estonia, 1,700-ish, Lithuania a bit less. So you see just really a dramatic difference in the number of cases that you have over there. There hasn't been a lockdown in place in Latvia, but a slowdown. Education has been from home. So kids haven't been out and about, but now from June 1st, exams, for example, can take place in person. Stores have mostly stayed open, but physical distancing has been really strictly enforced to make sure that people aren't getting too close to each other. People coming together, people can't come together in big groups, just small groups. And that will also increase, as the summer continues. The most exciting thing there, from having so few cases across the 3 countries, is that the borders have opened up. So since May 15th, there is free movement between the 3 Baltic states. You can't have been outside of the 3 Baltic states in order to take part in this. You can't have been in the previous 2 weeks. You can't be infected. You can't have been close to somebody who has been positive. But without those exceptions, you can now have free movement and travel between the Baltic states, which is really important there as the summer opens up. And when you look at that, you just see the fact that this could be a model for other places too. And there are considerations elsewhere, although the Baltics are the first to actually do it, of how to create small bubbles where when you have few enough cases, you can pass freely and explore your surroundings. And also, this is important for business and lots of trade connections that exist between the countries. But again, all of this is done with caution and taking careful measures, and with all these openings, there's the risk, and with somehow when it's warm and sunny and some restrictions are eased, so that it means everything goes back to normal. And then reflecting back on Belgium, the borders still here are closed. So that is something that is very notable. Lots of people are accustomed to passing between Belgium, the Netherlands, France, Germany, Luxembourg. These places are very close. There are Belgian enclaves in the Netherlands. So the interaction between these countries is very frequent. and having the borders up and only essential movement being possible, so for work across these borders, makes everything feel very different. And there's a lot of anticipation to when that will end and when Europe will feel freer in the way that we have become very accustomed to over here. So that's a first look from here. Yeah.
Thank you, Kristine. That was terrific. Very much a mixed picture. Pretty good news coming from the Baltics, something to watch very closely. Much more of a cautious outlook looking from Brussels. Yvonne, I'd love to hear from you now, and you also can offer this dual perspective, given that you work in Vienna, but you've been in Belgrade. You also offer a unique personal perspective on this crisis, given that you were afflicted with COVID. So it's terrific to see you and looking so well. But so Yvonne, yeah, the situation from as you see it, how it's playing out, how the specifically day to day, but then also the broader policy questions that the crisis is raising.
Thanks very much, Derek. It's great to be with the GMF family again. Indeed, I was struck with the virus and spent 4 weeks in hospital. Fortunately, I was a kind of middle range case, and it's been 4 weeks that I've been out and feeling very well. But yes, I was on the front line, and as in so many other countries, the doctors, nurses, cleaning ladies were doing an incredible job, and kudos must go out to these people in the difficult circumstances they've worked in. I'll talk about Austria, Serbia, and the Balkan region in the brief 5 minutes that you've given me. Austria was one of the countries that went into early lockdown and was one of the first to open up as well. Practically everything in Austria is open: public transport, trains. The airport will be opening very soon. Schools are, as in other countries, where they've opened on special schedules. So children go to school ways so that the numbers are small in the classes. I have friends comparatively, Austria has come to some kind of new normal. Masks, very much of what Kristine said applies to both all the cases that I'm talking about. Masks obligatory in shops and closed spaces. Restaurants have reopened 6 days ago in Vienna. Social distancing, all of these things apply as well. Austria was unfortunately notoriously known for having kept a ski resort open in the early days in the region of Tyrol, where a lot of Scandinavian and German tourists were, and they kept it open for a week longer after they learned about it, which meant spreading the virus to the Nordic countries, to Iceland and to Germany. And they came under very strict and rigorous rules when the Chancellor realized, the young Austrian Chancellor Sebastian Kurz realized what was going on. Just to give you a perspective on the numbers, unfortunately, Belgium is really the very sad front runner, which has 800 deaths per 1 million inhabitants. To put things into perspective, Austria has 71 deaths per 1 million, and Serbia, where I am now, has 33. Experience, they have 15 deaths per 285 deaths. So it gives you a sense of how countries have dealt. All the countries that we're speaking from, including Slovakia, where Pavol is, are small countries. Belgium is 11 million, Slovakia is roughly 5.5. And what our colleague and friend Ivan Krastev has called the copycat kind of procedure was very much the dynamic that Europe and this part of broad Central and Eastern Europe went through. People were consulting very intensely. The leaders were consulting, looking and following each other in lockstep on close down and then in ways in which to tackle these issues. Serbia opened up also about 2 weeks ago on the 7th of May, after a very, very strict lockdown, probably stricter than in other places. A state of emergency was called by the president, sidelining the parliament. So there were a number of not so good parliamentary moves, sort of an authoritarian trend there. And elections have been announced for the 21st of June. Lots of commentary and criticism. Is it the right thing to do, as we don't know how everyone comes out of this situation? I can answer more detailed questions on that as we go further in the Q&A period. The interesting thing is, of course, this debate that exists everywhere, the economy versus the health, or vice versa, health versus economy. A lot of these countries are dependent on tourism, and there's a huge pressure for these countries to open up as soon as they can. There was a four-way call between the leaders of Bulgaria, Romania, Greece, and Serbia. Greece will open up completely on June 15th to try and get some of that lost revenue on tourism. For those of you who love your Aegean Greek islands, there won't be any restrictions to enter, no tests to pass, and no quarantines. Austria is still on a quarantine system. So when I go back, I will either have to quarantine for 2 weeks in Vienna or pass a PCR test to see whether I'm positive or negative, which costs about $200 at the airport. So we'll see. Things evolve very quickly and they can change overnight, but everyone's itching to open up so people can start traveling. Germany and Austria have decided to reopen their border on June 15th. So mid-June seems to be the kind of date where things might move, unless obviously there are negative tendencies that will appear. It's really the schools that are a big question. Obviously, children being locked down hasn't been an easy way to handle this. Let me just end on the what we all see has been heralded as an important move in the European Union, the Macron Merkel deal. Austria falls into what are called the quote unquote frugal countries, and they've kind of put their hand up to stop, along with Denmark, Sweden, and the Netherlands. The Chancellor Sebastian Kurz has been vocal about that. And so the jury is out. Obviously, I think there'll be a lot of hand-wringing behind the scenes so that some version of what Macron and Merkel have come out with moves forward, because, and this is my final point, what has come across clearly is if we don't hang together, we'll hang separately.
Thank you, Ivan, for that terrific update. And I'm glad you brought up the Macron-Merkel deal. I'm hoping we can get into that in the Q&A, because I'd be interested, Kristine, in your perspective on that. Pavol, perhaps you can touch on that in your opening. But over to you, Pavol, for the perspective from Bratislava. And before, Pavol, you start, I just want to remind folks who've joined the call since we started, during the Q&A, we will be calling on people and allowing others to hear your voice. And so if you do have a question, use the hand raise feature on the Zoom system, which should be at the bottom of your screen. Raise your hand virtually. I will then see you, put you in the queue, and be able to call on you when we turn to the Q&A. Pavol, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Derek. Also, I am very glad that you are doing this and zooming on our territory, because nowadays saying that we are in the same boat, it's has the full sense of this proverb, because COVID is uniting all of us, and how we are coping with these, or how COVID pandemics affects individual states, it differs greatly. I think that Slovakia is a rather peculiar case in the whole story of pandemic, because we had election campaign during outburst of these epidemics situation, which was on 29th of February. By then, many countries already reported cases. In our country, nothing. So we looked like island in infected Europe. And elections 29th of February. And after that, new government was started to be formed. And we got first case only on 6th of March. So government within, coalition forming process was connected with dealing with corona crisis. So for government which came to power on 21st of March, it was already fully covered. Government sworn in with masks. So we are most masked country in the world, and probably the only government which had family photo in masks. So you could never see nowadays anybody, if you are a member of government or parliament, going to television or having press conference, press briefing without mask. So I think that it just shows that the restrictive measures which Slovak government took was extremely serious. And anecdotally, almost there was one TV journalist which had Prime Minister Matović and our Minister of Health in TV studio. She was interviewing them since they came power, and she said that, why don't we have a masks? So, and suddenly Prime Minister had to put mask on, his health minister and journalists put, and I think that this was like signal that all of us have to have this. Then suddenly lockdown was very serious, schools closed, companies, sports, everything. So I think that only yesterday we suddenly started to have broader opening. Today, if you are walking on street, only family members, as of yesterday, don't need to have a mask if they are together. If you don't have a mask, you have to be 5 meters away from others. If you go to restaurant, only 2 people can sit together and you have to be 2 meters apart. Schools will be opening only as of June. All of them, including kindergartens, are closed. It was announced yesterday that June 1st will be opening for schools. And several other issues related to opening of the country were announced in so-called phase 4 as of yesterday. As far as borders, which colleagues were referring, we are completely closed. If none of you can come to Slovakia without going to quarantine, and it is state quarantine, you have to stay 2 weeks in state institutions, hotels or hostels and so on. And if everything goes well, tomorrow we will start so-called intelligent quarantine, that you will get app into your smartphone and you can stay at home for 2 weeks and not to go to government facility. So this will happen tomorrow, but no one, be it Slovak or foreigner, can come until today to Slovakia not going into 2-week quarantine. Even if Austria is just, I see Austria from the window of my apartment, I cannot go. Only since yesterday we are allowed to go for 1 day, but you have to fill form and police will then sign it and you have to come back within 24 hours. If you would stay 2 days, you would have to go to 2-week quarantine. So it just shows how seriously still situation looks like. All of these paid off because Slovakia has the lowest. So we call our Prime Minister very proudly said we are European champion. This is something which we are semi-jokingly using all the time because we have only 28 death cases. And so Slovakia has 5.4 million citizens and only 28 people. Extremely well. And these psychologies that we have to be careful not to get second wave. We are looking at Singapore, Hong Kong, and South Korea. We are not comparing ourselves too much with others, but those who had low death rate and then are either getting or not getting second wave. The second wave is of something which is still navigating government's decision about opening and so on. Tourism, Ivan mentioned that for Balkans, for Slovakia, Croatia is primary tourist destination. Croats already opened borders. Slovenes already said that there is no quarantine. So I think that now dilemmas are, should we stay at home for vacation because we are a non-infected country, or should we risk and go? So government, including our friend, Foreign Minister Ivan Korčok, is campaigning, stay at home, Slovakia is a beautiful country. We can go to Croatia next year, or Turkey, or whatever other country if it opens. So tourism is, I think that we are changing last minute to next year program as far as tourism is concerned. And last thing, broader issue, I think that regional cooperation weakened a lot because every country has its own decision. Austria, Hungary, Poland, Czech Republic. I think that the opening of borders is expected at the mid of June or after. Slovakia will do it later than 15th of June, as Czech Republic, for example, and Austria announced. So I think that we do not have from European Union some synchronized policy. This is done case by case. Every country is deciding based on epidemic situation and so on. I think that European Union, which was at the beginning very much criticized for very slow response, particularly in Italy, I think that nowadays we see that European Union is key to overcoming economic hardship, which is hitting very seriously all our countries. And I think that now economy is resonating, and how to rescue businesses which are losing employees, how to give them subsidies. So this is primary topic which is resonating. But all of us understand that since we are export-oriented country, that without healthy European market, we are unable to do that. Without European structural funds, which were eased also for us to deal with our economic troubles, we can't make it. On the one hand, one would expect that EU would be only praised, but propaganda machinery and hybrid warfare tools are very active. So nowadays, Foreign Ministry just last week announced that we created also special unit within Foreign Ministry to fight hybrid warfare, because these dilemmas of how erosion of European Union and European solution is done also by those who traditionally are fighting against European Union or the West in general. I will stop here.
Thank you, Pavol, for that terrific update, and to Ivan and Kristine again for yours. We're going to turn to our questions now. And again, if you have a question, use the hand raise feature in this Zoom system, and I'll be able to see your hand raised and call on you. We'll unmute you and I can call on you. And I've got the first question. And Pavol, I want to pick up actually where you ended, which you talked about hybrid warfare and those that are seeking to undermine European unity and also obviously transatlantic unity in this crisis. And in the early stages, we of course heard a lot about the way that China and Russia were trying to exploit this crisis and the lack of response to this crisis, and to show in both their cases initially their own magnanimous, charitable contributions, much of which were sort of somewhat fictional. Of course, Russia's in a much different place right now, and China in particular has been a huge issue here in the United States, both in terms of its culpability at the beginning of the crisis and also its continued efforts to hide what's happening. And I just curious, and Kristine, I'd like to start with you and then go to Ivan and then Pavol, just quickly from each of you, how you see the role that Russia, China, or perhaps other foreign actors are using this crisis to exploit weaknesses in the response, but also to try to exploit European unity, as Pavol suggested, but also the transatlantic unity. Thank you.
Thanks, Derek. Yeah, so at ASD, we have a tracker called the Hamilton Dashboard, in which we are able to look at what the state and state-funded sources from Russia and China say on various things. And of course, we've seen since the beginning of this lots of rhetoric that's much more aggressive against European countries, against transatlantic unity. We've seen Chinese diplomatic accounts share RT articles that discuss, that speculate, for example, what is the role of the US troop presence in Europe in spreading the virus, criticizing the response, hard tactics by police against protesters in European capitals, other questions like this. So we've seen the fanning of divisions and open criticism from Chinese sources, which is new, and ongoing from Russian, which continues. But at the same time, I think a lot of the favorable relationships that some authoritarian leaders have made and authoritarian states with European countries continue. And so the history of what your relationships have been really also defines a lot of how perceptions continue today. And Pavol mentioned tracing apps and the smart technology that we're seeing across Europe that is being used, and looking at the domestic Belgian press and how they're discussing the question of tracking and apps. Their headlines are, beware of foreign app manufacturers, or beware of some of this technology. And for me, looking at that, I immediately think of some more restrictive regimes, or Chinese technology in the context of some of the 5G debates. But when you look at it, it's often criticism of Apple or some of the American tech companies, right? So Belgium, for example, has a cybersecurity center with Huawei. And so there has been a lot of cooperation formally between some of the Chinese tech giants in Belgium. So that is, so that kind of friendliness perhaps continues today, and skepticism of the US versus others, even though we're seeing a lot of this change in aggressive rhetoric and tactics from the authoritarian states.
Yvonne.
Yeah, sure. Let me put it simply, where the European Union is not as present, or the US, that makes space for the Chinas and the Russias and Turkeys of this world. And in this case, the sort of fumbling of the ball by the European Union on the first days and first couple of weeks gave China an opening. And in the case of Serbia, which has been sort of shown as a case where China had a particularly aggressive sort of support with planes sending masks and various other medical equipment. And the president, I would say, foolishly came out with a very strong statement about the ironclad friendship with China and the European Union being a fairy tale, which he had to backtrack on about 10 days later, 2 weeks later, because he met with all the EU ambassadors and had to counter a pro-China poster in the streets of Serbian cities with a pro-EU poster that came out 3 or 4 weeks later. So you can see kind of the seesawing in this attempt to kind of be good with everyone. And of course, had to repeat once again after 4 weeks that the European Union was the strategic goal. But clearly, this gave China an opportunity to use its quote unquote soft power in the medical support field. Russia, much less because of its particular situation. There have been a very good series of analytic articles by think tanks and civil society organizations here in the country, which I'm glad to share with anyone who's interested. But it remains the case that, as you know, there was the European Union summit virtual in Zagreb on May 6th, which was supposed to be, as it was under the Croatian presidency, with not as forceful language on the future enlargement to the Western Balkans. In fact, the word enlargement was not at all used in the final document, although Ursula von der Leyen said that the future of the region is in the European Union.
Thanks. Pavol.
Yeah, I think that this would be really worthwhile to study more closely how COVID situation influenced public diplomacies of United States, China, Russia, and European Union, what worked and what not, and try to avoid wishful thinking and political correctness while we will be doing this analysis. Because I think that after first month, when there was public opinion poll made here in Slovakia, we got shocking news, people like us on this call, that vast majority of Slovaks felt that China is most healthy country in COVID pandemics, us, because they saw few planes of medical equipment, masks, and so on coming from China and nothing from EU. They saw image of Chinese doctors coming to Italy, helping when European Union was not providing facial masks. Watching United States behavior was rather joke or fear for us than inspiration. Watching European response at those first weeks was difficult to understand because EU repeated health, we don't have masks, so everybody was trying to get masks. And EU repeated that health is not an EU, it is national issue, not EU's issue, that it is done on national level. So I think that it took enormous effort and energy of policymakers, journalists, NGOs, analysts to explain what and how EU behaves. But all in all, after first month, China was viewed very favorably, Russia second, and EU third. And Russia did nothing, but through conspiracy theories, how and what, whether Americans wanted to spread this virus through some military action or world global powers want to chip us via vaccination, and all kinds of most bizarre thing one can imagine started to pollute people's mind who were full of fear of dying. So for that reason, I think that all those who tried to manipulate public discourse or manipulate facts had very fertile ground. And I think that these played enormously important role in perception, but at the same time, I think we are not smart enough, because what I found ridiculous, after 1 month a survey was done, it was for almost all next month used. Nobody did second follow-up when EU was already viewed more favorably. So I think we are very lousy with having data and using them in public discourse. And I think that last comment on this, I think for you in the United States, you will have enormously difficult task now to show leadership and so on, because you are having close to 100,000 dead people, all measures which, and how Anthony Fauci, who became famous also in Europe, watching him, how he was sort of interacting with White House and so on. So I think that for transatlantic relation and credibility of United States, I think that COVID will be extremely complicating factor in situation where US, which has highest number of Nobel Prize winners for medical and physiological, and all kinds of things, best universities and so on. And at the same time, you have so many irrational behaviors, which we are watching with enormous concern, which is still going on.
Well, Pavol, I definitely would like to touch on that before we break, and I understand we only have 5 more minutes. One of the questions that has touched on that, and that's this irrational behavior, the pushback against some of the restrictions that have been put in place, or the social distancing measures, or even in the United States, controversy in some places about wearing a mask. And Yvonne, you mentioned the economic pressures that all countries are feeling to try to reopen their economies, get things moving again. But the difficulty of doing that while still maintaining social distancing, keeping numbers down in restaurants, not holding large events. And we have seen in other places in Europe, and the situation in Germany has received a lot of coverage here in the United States, and some of the protests that we've seen throughout Germany in the last several weeks that are very similar to the protests we have seen in the United States, and bring together a somewhat unusual mix of folks from the far right to the anti-vaccination movement to the civil libertarians. Just curious, have you seen much of that from Brussels or Vienna, Belgrade, Bratislava? Baltic, so my guess is there probably hasn't been too much since things have gone relatively well there. But that's become a central part of the debate about this crisis in the United States and in places like Germany. The pushback and the questioning of the science and the questioning of the restrictions. How do each of you see it? Kristine, let's start with you.
Yeah, there hasn't been mass protests here. There hasn't been large pushback. I think that the government is being quite proactive in opening, and that might be part of it as well.
Yvonne?
Well, here there were two levels of protest. One level was a pure civic protest of people after applauding the health workers at 8:05 p.m. There was a banging of pots against the government and the very restrictive lockdown measures. People of over 65 years of age were not allowed to go out at all. They were allowed to go out after curfew, which was very strict, sometimes for 4 days in a row over holiday weekends like Easter or 1st of May. They were allowed to go out for half an hour and then an hour after 6 p.m. Or even worse, they were allowed to go once a week to supermarkets from 4 a.m. till 7 a.m. And this really caused a lot of protest. The other protest was more political, and that has been the sidelining of the parliament. Because the president, although his constitutional powers are not that strong, actually introduced the state of emergency, and then much later it was brought back to parliament, where the parliament sort of decided that this was all right. Obviously, he has a full majority in the parliament, so it was more symbolic, and the opposition is boycotting. Most of the opposition, although part of the opposition is back in parliament. But Pavol is absolutely right. The conspiracy theories have been swirling, the 5G, Wuhan laboratory, US. So you have the tabloid media are absolutely all over this, trying to sell. And then unfortunately, they've recruited some doctors who give sort of voice to this with question marks, but the mere fact that doctors are talking about it sort of gives quote unquote credence to those who thrive on conspiracy theories. And that has been very detrimental, but I think that belongs to a broader kind of dynamic around the world. And I must say, adding to Pavol, saying that we need to speak honestly, frankly, looking at what has been coming out of the White House has been totally baffling and bewildering to all of us.
I think that in Slovakia, even if we had such a very strict measures, we haven't seen public protests because people couldn't even go out. In most cases, but generally people accepted these measures. When public opinion poll was done, whether these very draconic lockdown they approve, people were in almost 75% approved government steps because they saw results, that we had so few death cases. There was direct correlation between, so people saw, okay, people around us are dying, even brother Czechs across the border are having enormous numbers, and Austrians and so on. So it pays off, so people were disciplined. Secondly, opposition was not boycotting any legislation which was passed in order to do these steps. They agreed on, there was only one case when there was sort of a clash. It was sort of bugging law, which would allow you to track people, whether they are, I mean, those who are infected, whether they could be tracked and not. There was even Constitutional Court then sort of stepped in and said that these should, because these would be restricting civic liberties and so on. But all other laws went very smoothly, very quickly. So both coalition and opposition agreed on this. So I don't think that this played major role. And I think that nowadays we definitely are going to see more tension and political dynamism after Corona will be departing, because people will be more sensitive now to overcoming economic hardship. And once you will not use argument, we have to do this because of Corona, you will have to come and bring solutions to schools, education, companies, businesses, and so on. So one would expect bigger dynamism now after this easing of our life will come. And last point, I think that we are lucky that Germany will be assuming EU presidency in second half of the year. I think that Angela Merkel is viewed as very serious leader, and even during this campaign, over 300 public intellectuals, others asked that Angela Merkel should be more active lead and so on. And since this is almost end of her career, I think that she would like to leave legacy, and her talks with French President Macron and others now to do something more robust and show that the European Union shouldn't give up and come out with some solutions and so on. So I think that in a way, also for our political and economic calendar, this is viewed as something favorable.
Thanks, Pavol. Well, unfortunately, we're out of time, and there's a lot of questions that I would have liked to get to, particularly to follow up with comments that both Yvonne and Pavol made on the perceptions of the United States and the impact this crisis is having on U.S. leadership in the transatlantic relationship. But we will save that for another conversation. And it'd be great to be able to bring the three of you back together at some point in the near future, because this has been a super insightful 45 minutes. I want to thank Kristine Berzina and Yvonne Vejvoda and Pavol Demeš for their terrific presentation and updates. Thank the participants who tuned in and asked questions. I want to wish everyone well, to stay safe, to stay healthy, and take good care. We'll see you again soon. Thank you again, everyone.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.